Late in November of 1921, a young man named Ned Doheny walked down a corridor of the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington, carrying a small leather satchel. His father's friend, Hugh Plunkett, was beside him. Inside the satchel was $100,000 in cash. They knocked on the door of the Secretary of the Interior of the United States, handed him the bag, and waited while he signed a note for it. Then the two young men went home to California. I have gone back to that hotel corridor more often than I can explain, because almost nothing about it looked like what it was. Two well-dressed young men, an errand for a rich father, a note signed and pocketed. It looked like a loan between friends, which is exactly what everyone involved would later swear it was. And yet, that quiet handoff in a hotel hallway would become the center of the largest corruption scandal in American history to that point, would send one man to a federal prison, would leave another acquitted of the very same crime, and would end 8 years later with both of the young couriers dead. Consider what grew out of that one afternoon: a Secretary of the Interior who went to prison for taking that money, the first man ever to sit in a president's cabinet and then walk into a federal penitentiary for a felony he committed in office. The oil tycoon who gave him the money tried for the same bribe in the same city and acquitted. A mansion of 46,000 square feet built by a father for his son, where that son would die 4 months after moving in. 2 men found shot in that mansion in the dark hours of a February morning, and a district attorney who closed the case in a day and a half, with no inquest and no autopsy. A ranch in New Mexico, foreclosed on by the very oil company whose owner had called the payment a friendly loan. And a version of what happened in that mansion that comes down to us 100 years later, almost entirely from the memoir of a single detective. Every one of those things is documented, and the strangest part of the Doheny story is not any one of them. It is that when the machinery of American justice looked at all of it, it produced almost nothing. This is the story of a bribe, a killing, and a cover-up. The 3 things everyone remembers about the richest oil family in California. It is also the story of how not one of them was ever proven, how the same $100,000 was ruled a crime for the man who took it and a loan for the man who gave it, how 2 men died in a locked wing of a great house and no inquest was ever held, and how the largest thing the Doheny fortune ever bought was not oil or marble or influence, but silence. I want to start in that hotel corridor with the satchel, because everything else in this story is an answer to the question of what was really in it. Before we go on, one quick thing. If you subscribe, it helps build a community around these and rewards the work that goes into them, and it is free. Chapter 1. The Satchel. The errand itself was simple. Sometime around the end of November 1921, Edward L. Doheny, one of the richest men in America, sent his only son to Washington with $100,000 in cash. The son was Edward Doheny Jr., called Ned, then 28 years old. With him went Hugh Plunkett, a former garage attendant who had risen to become Ned's personal secretary and closest friend. The 2 men carried the money east, delivered it to Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, at his rooms in the Wardman Park Hotel, and returned home. That is the whole of the act. A father with more money than he could count, a trusted son, a loyal friend, a bag of cash, and a powerful man who took it. In the years to come, teams of senators, prosecutors, and federal judges would spend the better part of a decade trying to decide what that act had been. And the remarkable thing, the thing that sits at the dead center of this entire story, is that they never fully agreed. To Doheny, It was alone. He said so plainly, and he never stopped saying it. Albert Fall was an old friend, a man he had known since their days as young prospectors in the mining camps of the American Southwest 40 years earlier. Fall was cash poor and land rich, a proud frontier lawyer and rancher struggling to hold on to a spread called 3 Rivers in the Tularosa Basin of New Mexico. The two had first known each other as young men chasing silver in the same rough mining camps before either had anything, and the friendship was real and old. Doheny had money the way the ocean has water. Lending an old friend $100,000 was, by the standards of a man worth more than $100 million, roughly what lending $20 would be to anyone else. To the government, it was a bribe, because at the moment the satchel changed hands, Albert Fall controlled something Edward Doheny wanted very badly. He controlled the naval oil reserves, vast underground fields the United States government had set aside to fuel its warships. And within a few months of taking the money, Fall would lease one of those reserves, a California field called Elk Hills, to Doheny, without competitive bidding, on terms that stood to make the oilman a fortune on top of the fortune he already had. I want to slow down on the shape of this because the shape is the whole point. The same $100,000 was two completely different things depending on which end of it you stood at. From Doheny's end, it was generosity, the easy kindness of a rich man to a poor friend. From Fall's end, it was the price of a public trust, and the money did not change at all between those two ends. Only the men did. That single fact that the same act was innocent or criminal, depending only on who was looking, is the engine of everything that followed. And the courts would never fully resolve it. There is a detail here that the years have almost worn smooth. But it matters. The money went in cash, in a bag, carried by hand across the country by the giver's own son. Not a check, not a wire, not a transfer between banks that would leave a clean and dated record. A satchel of currency, hand-delivered. Doheny would later insist this meant nothing, that it was simply how he chose to help a friend. Others would look at the same fact and see a man who did not want a paper trail, a payment structured to leave no clean record of who gave what to whom and when. Both readings survive to this day. The bag does not tell us which is true, and no one who could have told us ever did, under oath or otherwise. What is certain is that the two young men who carried it, Ned and Hugh, walked out of that hotel and back into their ordinary lives. They were not the principals. They were the couriers, the son and the friend, doing what the rich father asked, and neither of them could have known that they had just carried the first weight of a burden that would follow them, quite literally, to the grave. To understand how heavy it would become, you have to understand the man who sent them, and where his impossible fortune came from. It began, of all places, with a sharpened stick and a hole in the ground. Chapter 2. The Eucalyptus Pole. Edward Lawrence Doheny was born in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, in 1856, the son of an Irish laborer who had fled the famine. He was quick, restless, and poor. He left school young, worked for a time, surveying land for the government out west, and then spent close to 20 years as a prospector, chasing silver and gold through the territories of Arizona and New Mexico, mostly failing. He was, by most accounts, a gifted and driven man who had simply never caught the one break that turns effort into money. He had known real hardship in the camps, and at least one stretch where he nearly starved. By the time he arrived in Los Angeles at the start of the 1890s, he was in his mid-30s and nearly broke, a man whose life so far had been one long study in near misses. Los Angeles in those years was a dusty town of a few tens of thousands, not yet the city it would become. And it happened to be sitting on oil. The story, which Doheny told for the rest of his life, is that he noticed a cart carrying a load of dark, tarry earth, brea, the Spanish word for pitch, that people were burning as a cheap fuel. He asked where it came from. He followed the answer to a field near what is now Echo Park, close to where Dodger Stadium stands today. And in 1892, with his old prospecting partner Charles Canfield, he began to dig. They had almost no money and no proper equipment. They dug a shaft by hand. When the fumes grew too dangerous to keep digging, the story goes, Doheny improvised a drill by sharpening the trunk of a eucalyptus tree and driving it down into the earth. At a depth of a few hundred feet, the oil came. It was not much at first, 40 or so barrels a day. But it was, by most accounts, the first successful oil well in the Los Angeles City field, and it set off one of the great booms in American history. Canfield and Doheny leased more lots, drilled more wells, and within a couple of years the neighborhood was a forest of wooden derricks, oil pooling in the yards of houses, the whole district given over to the thing coming up out of the ground. I find it worth pausing on the eucalyptus pole because everything else in this story is so heavy with marble and money and power that it is easy to forget where it started. A broke Irish prospector in his mid-30s, a man who had failed at nearly everything he had tried, kneeling in a hand-dug pit and driving a sharpened tree trunk into the ground because he could not afford anything better. That is the origin of the fortune that would later move a satchel of cash across the country as casually as a tip. The distance between that pit and the marble mansions to come is the real measure of the man, and it is a distance almost no one travels. Doheny traveled all of it, and he never quite lost the frontier prospector's sense that rules were things that happened to other, smaller men. Within a few years, there were hundreds of wells across Los Angeles, many of them drilled by men who had followed Doheny's lead. And Doheny himself was no longer poor. He had learned the one lesson the mining camps had never taught him, which was how to be early to something enormous and hold on. Oil was not silver. Oil was everywhere beneath the city, and the world was about to run on it. The automobile was coming, and the truck, and the oil-fired warship, and the man who controlled the fuel would control a great deal more than a mine ever could. The timing of his life had finally turned, and it had turned completely. He was past 40 when it did, which is worth remembering about a man we meet as a titan. For most of his life, he had been a failure. But Los Angeles was only the beginning, and by the standards of what came next, it was almost small. The wells that would make Doheny not merely rich but one of the wealthiest men in the entire country were not in California at all. They were south, across the border, in the oil country of Mexico. And it was there, in a jungle clearing, that his fortune stopped being large and became something closer to unimaginable. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It is free, and it is what keeps these coming. Chapter 3. Cerro Azul. In 1900, Edward Doheny turned his attention to Mexico. He had heard that the land along the Gulf Coast near Tampico showed the same signs of oil that had made him rich in Los Angeles, and he went to see for himself. Over the next decade and a half, he bought and leased enormous tracts of Mexican land, built the infrastructure to drill and ship the oil, and gambled a great deal of his California money on the belief that the Tampico fields would be even larger than anyone imagined. For years, the gamble looked uncertain. Then in 1916, it stopped being uncertain in the most dramatic way possible. The well was called Cerro Azul No. 4. When Doheny's crews brought it in the jungle near Tampico, it came in as what was then one of the largest oil wells the world had ever seen. By some accounts, it produced on the order of 250,000 barrels a day at its peak, and in its early hours, it threw a column of oil close to 600 feet into the air, higher than any building in Los Angeles at the time. Over the years that followed, that single well would yield tens of millions of barrels. It was not a well. It was a fortune erupting out of the ground, and it ran for years. The Mexican fields turned Doheny from a successful regional oilman into something on an entirely different scale. A man whose oil helped fuel the Allied navies of the First World War and whose tankers moved it across the world. With Mexican oil behind it, Doheny's company, Pan American Petroleum and Transport, grew into the largest American oil company by 1920. And Doheny himself crossed a line that very few men in the country had ever crossed. By the middle of the 1920s, his net worth was reckoned at more than $100 million, a sum that, by the standards of that era, made him richer than John D. Rockefeller. He owned oil on two sides of a border, a shipping fleet to carry it, and more liquid wealth than almost any private citizen alive. In 1925, he sold the bulk of his Pan American holdings to Standard Oil of Indiana, keeping his California operations, and the sale only deepened his cash position. He was not merely rich in oil and land, which can be hard to spend. He was rich in money, the kind you can put in a bag. I want to sit for a moment with what that kind of money does to a person's sense of the possible, because it is essential to everything that follows. When a man is worth $100 million in 1922, the ordinary frictions of life simply dissolve for him. Rules that bind other people begin to look, from where he stands, like suggestions. Favors that would ruin an ordinary man look like courtesies. $100,000, the sum that would later be argued over in federal court for years, was to Edward Doheny a rounding error, a figure he could send across the country in a bag without noticing its absence. That is not an accusation. It is a description of a state of mind, and it is the state of mind in which the satchel makes sense. To a man of Doheny's wealth, handing an old friend $100,000 genuinely did not feel like a bribe, whatever a statute might say. It felt like what rich men do for friends who are struggling. The tragedy, and the scandal, is that the friend in question happened to be holding the keys to the national oil reserves at the exact moment the kindness arrived. Wealth on that scale does not make a man careful about how his generosity looks. It makes him careless, because he has never in his adult life had to think about how anything looks. That carelessness, more than any greed, is what would nearly destroy him. Because that is the part the fortune could not change, however large it grew. The money was real, the friendship may well have been real, but the timing was poison. And in the autumn of 1921, the government of the United States opened a door that Edward Doheny wanted to walk through more than almost anything. And the man standing at that door, holding it open, was the same old friend from the mining camps who needed $100,000. Chapter 4. The Reserves. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what a naval oil reserve was. In the early years of the 20th century, the United States Navy had converted its warships from coal to oil, which meant that the fleet now ran on petroleum. And a nation without secure oil was a nation whose navy could be starved. So the government set aside several underground oil fields on public land and declared them off-limits to private drilling. They were an insurance policy, kept in the ground, reserved for the ships. The two most important were a field in Wyoming known as Teapot Dome, named for a sandstone rock formation shaped like a teapot that stood above it, and a field in California called Elk Hills, not far from the oil country where Doheny had already made himself rich. They were, in the plainest terms, the nation's emergency fuel, and they were not supposed to be for sale. For years, these reserves were controlled by the Navy. Then, in 1921, the new administration of President Warren Harding rearranged things. By an executive order signed that spring, control of the naval oil reserves was transferred from the Navy Department to the Department of the Interior, and the Department of the Interior was run by Albert Bacon Fall, a former senator from New Mexico, a rancher, a self-made frontier lawyer, and, as it happened, Edward Doheny's old friend from the mining camps. What Fall did with that control is the whole of the scandal. Quietly, without competitive bidding, he leased the reserves to two private oilmen. He leased Teapot Dome in Wyoming to a man named Harry Sinclair, and he leased Elk Hills in California to Edward Doheny. Doheny's arrangement also called for him to build the Navy a set of fuel storage tanks at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, which gave the deal a patriotic gloss, a service to the fleet rather than a gift to a friend. The leases were enormously valuable. By the estimates of the time, the Elk Hills arrangement alone stood to earn Doheny something on the order of $100 million in profit, though that figure was a projection, and the reserve never produced anything close to it. Even so, the scale is the point. Fall was handing his friend a chance at a second fortune the size of the first. Now set two numbers beside each other, because the arithmetic tells the story more plainly than any argument could. Albert Fall, as Secretary of the Interior, earned a government salary of $12,000 a year. The satchel that Ned Doheny carried to his hotel room contained $100,000, more than 8 years of his official pay in cash, in a bag. And the Doheny loan was not the only money that found its way to Fall. From Harry Sinclair, over the same period, came Liberty bonds and cash that by various accounts totaled close to $200,000 more, funneled through Fall's son-in-law. All told, the gifts that reached the secretary during the period he was leasing the reserves have been reckoned at something around $400,000. I have tried reading through this to find the innocent version, and I want to be fair that one exists on paper. Doheny's loan and Sinclair's bonds were, in theory, private matters unconnected to the leases. That is what the men involved swore. But the arithmetic sits there and will not move. A public official on $12,000 a year suddenly had the means to pour money into a failing New Mexico ranch, to buy adjoining land, to restock it with cattle, at the exact moment he was signing away the nation's emergency oil to the men whose money he was taking. You do not have to call it a bribe to see why the whole country soon would. The money and the leases did not have to be formally connected in a contract for the connection to be obvious to anyone who looked. That is the thing about corruption at this level. It rarely needs a signed agreement. It only needs a rich man, a powerful friend, and a sum of money large enough to matter to one of them and small enough to be forgotten by the other. For a while, though, none of it was visible. The leases were signed, the money was quiet, and the arrangement might have held indefinitely. It came apart because of a small thing, the kind of small thing that undoes large men. Fall's neighbors in New Mexico noticed that a cash-poor rancher had suddenly become flush, and they began to wonder aloud where the money had come from. In 1922, the United States Senate began to wonder with them. Hit subscribe if you want the next one. It costs nothing, and it takes a second. Chapter 5. The Committee. The man who pulled the thread was a senator from Montana named Thomas Walsh. Beginning in 1922, and in earnest through 1923, Walsh led a Senate committee investigating the leasing of the naval oil reserves. And for a long time, he found very little. Fall had resigned from the cabinet by then and had covered his tracks with reasonable care. The leases themselves were not obviously illegal on their face. What Walsh had was a suspicion, and a rancher who had come into unexplained money. and for months the investigation looked as though it might quietly die. What broke it open was the question of Fall's sudden wealth, and here the story takes a turn that is almost hard to believe. The investigators kept asking how Fall had paid for the improvements to his ranch. And eventually the answer came, not dragged out of a reluctant witness, but volunteered, freely, by Edward Doheny himself. In January of 1924, Doheny testified before the committee and told them plainly that yes, he had given Albert Fall $100,000. He simply framed it as a loan. It was a personal matter, he said, money lent to a friend of more than 30 years, secured by a note, entirely separate from any oil lease. I find Doheny's testimony one of the most revealing moments in the whole affair because of how calm it was. He did not hide the money, he announced it. A guilty man, you would think, hides $100,000 in cash. Doheny volunteered it to the United States Senate as though naming it out loud were proof of its innocence. And for a man of his wealth and his certainties, it very nearly was proof, in his own mind. He seems genuinely to have believed that because he thought of it as a loan, it was one, and that his saying so should settle the matter. It is the purest expression of what a great fortune does to a man's sense of the world. He had been believed and obeyed for so long, by so many, that his own account of a thing had come to feel, to him, like the thing itself. It did not settle the matter. It detonated it. The admission that the Secretary of the Interior had taken $100,000 in cash from the very oil man he had handed a naval reserve turned a slow Senate inquiry into a national scandal overnight. The word Teapot Dome, the name of the Wyoming field, became shorthand for government corruption, and it stayed that way for half a century, until a break-in at an office building in Washington gave the country a newer one. For 2 generations, if an American wanted to name the worst a cabinet could do, the phrase was Teapot Dome. Cabinet secretaries resigned. The Navy Secretary, Edwin Denby, stepped down. The Navy Secretary, Edwin Denby, stepped down. The Attorney General, Harry Daugherty, was forced out amid the wider rot of the Harding administration. The government appointed 2 special prosecutors, Owen Roberts, who would later sit on the Supreme Court, and Atlee Pomerene, a former senator, and gave them a single charge: to take the reserves back and to put the guilty in prison. It was, at the time, the most serious corruption investigation the country had ever mounted against its own government. Taking the reserves back proved to be the easy part. The government sued, and the courts agreed that the leases had been obtained through fraud and corruption, and canceled them. The cases went as high as the Supreme Court, which agreed. Elk Hills and Teapot Dome went back to the Navy. On the question of the leases themselves, the law was clear, and the outcome was swift and complete. The oil was returned to the people it belonged to, and the arrangement that Fall had built in secret was undone in public. But the other question, the question of the men, of what should happen to Albert Fall and Edward Doheny for the thing they had so plainly done, turned out to be far harder and far stranger than anyone expected. The same set of facts, the same $100,000, the same satchel carried by the same 2 young men, would be placed before 2 juries in the same courthouse, and the 2 juries would reach opposite conclusions. Before we get there, though, we have to follow the 2 young couriers home, to a great gray house that a father was building for his son on a hill above Beverly Hills, because that house is where this story stops being about money and starts being about death. Chapter 6. Greystone. While the Teapot Dome trials ground on through the middle of the 1920s, Edward Doheny did something that only a very rich and very confident man would do in the middle of a corruption scandal. He built his son a palace. On the hillside above Beverly Hills, On a piece of the family ranch, he commissioned a house of a scale that Los Angeles had never seen. He gave the commission to a young architect named Gordon Kaufman, who would later design the face of Hoover Dam, and he spared nothing. The house rose on a piece of the family's own ranch land, a spread that ran to hundreds of acres across the hills above the city, land the family would later sell off to become some of the most expensive real estate in the country. The construction alone took the better part of 2 years and employed hundreds of workers. The house was called Greystone, for the gray Indiana limestone that faced its walls. It was enormous, more than 46,000 square feet, with 55 rooms, a slate roof from Wales, a steel frame, and a footprint that made it one of the largest private homes in the state. Construction began in early 1927. The grounds ran to formal gardens, terraces, fountains, a fire station, kennels, a greenhouse. The whole estate, house and land and everything on it, cost more than $3 million, and some accounts put the figure higher still. It was not a house so much as a small fortified world. It had its own fire station and its own water supply, a bowling alley, a billiard room, a screening room, and staff quarters for a small army of servants. Built to say that whatever the newspapers and the prosecutors might be saying, the Dohenys were not going anywhere. A family under federal indictment does not, as a rule, build a limestone palace on a hill in plain view of the city. Edward Doheny did, and the doing of it was a kind of statement, an act of confidence carved in stone against the possibility of ruin. It was a gift. Edward built it for his son Ned, and for Ned's wife, Lucy Smith Doheny, and their 5 children. When it was done, the father sold the whole thing to the son for the sum of $10, a legal formality that let him hand over the greatest house in Beverly Hills as casually as passing a plate. Ned and Lucy moved their family in during the autumn of 1928 into rooms that smelled of new stone and fresh paint at the top of a hill above a city their family had helped invent. Ned Doheny was, by the accounts that survive, a decent and well-liked man, a Navy veteran of the First World War, a graduate of the University of Southern California, devoted to his wife and his 5 children, and close, unusually close, to the family employee who had become his right hand. That employee was Hugh Plunkett, and the two of them had been bound together since long before the Satchel, since the days when Plunkett pumped gas at a station near the family home, and Ned took a liking to him. It is worth holding this image for a moment because of what is coming, and because of how little the people in it could see it. Picture the household in the last months of 1928, a father who has beaten back the government and kept his fortune, a son settling into a palace, a loyal friend, Hugh Plunkett, still close, still part of the family's daily life, the man who had carried the satchel beside Ned 7 years before. 5 children in a great stone house. From the outside, it looked like a family that had passed through the fire and come out whole. They had lived in the house for about 4 months. 4 months. A palace built to last 500 years, lived in by the man it was built for through a single autumn and a single winter. That is the fact that turns Greystone from a monument into something closer to a warning. The father built the son a palace to outlast the scandal, a house of steel and stone meant to stand for centuries, and the son would be dead inside it before the paint had fully cured. Whatever the money had bought, it had not bought time, and it had not bought safety, and in the deepest sense it had not bought the one thing the family most needed, which was for the thing that connected all of them, the satchel, the loan, the trials, to simply go away. The house was supposed to be the proof that they had survived. It became, instead, the place where the surviving stopped. Subscribing is how stories like this keep finding their way to you. It is free, and it tells me to keep making them. Chapter 7. The 16th of February. On the night of the 16th of February 1929, Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett died of gunshot wounds in a guest wing on the ground floor of Greystone. Both men were in their 30s. Ned was 35 and the father of 5. Plunkett was a few years younger. By morning, they were both dead, in the same wing of the same house, and the question of exactly what happened between them in the dark has never been answered to everyone's satisfaction in the 100 years since. Here is what the record establishes. That evening, the family physician, a doctor named Fishbaugh, was called away from a Hollywood theater and summoned urgently to the house. He arrived, by the accounts given afterward, sometime around 11 at night. By the time the authorities were notified and the scene was settled, both men were dead of gunshot wounds, and a revolver was present. Those are the bones of it, and they are not really in dispute. What surrounds those bones, the exact hour of each event, the order in which things happened, the words spoken and the shots fired, and the gaps of time between them, is where a century of argument lives. There was a reported gap of some hours between the deaths and the notification of the authorities, a gap in which the doctor and members of the household were present and the police were not. That gap is real, and it is the single detail that has fed more suspicion than any other. The official account, the one the district attorney would settle on, was a murder-suicide. In this version, Hugh Plunkett, who had been under severe strain, whose nerves had been worn raw by the endless legal proceedings and by his own troubles, came to the house that night in a disturbed state. Ned tried to calm him. At some point, Plunkett drew a pistol, shot Ned in the head, and then, in the moments afterward, turned the gun on himself. 2 men, 1 weapon, a breakdown, and a friendship that ended in the worst way a friendship can. That was the finding. That is what went into the record and what closed the case. There is a plausible human story underneath it. Plunkett had been ground down for years by the legal ordeal, had been urged to see a psychiatrist, had resisted, and had grown increasingly erratic. A man in that state, in that house, with a gun, is not hard to imagine. The official version is not absurd. It may well be exactly what happened. I have to be careful here, more careful than anywhere else in this story, because this is the exact point where documented fact ends and a century of theory begins. What is documented is spare. 2 men, dead of gunshots, in a house, with a doctor called and a gun present. Almost everything else, the sequence, the motive, who fired first, who fired at whom, the precise timeline of that night, rests on accounts given afterward by a small number of people, and on the interpretation of physical evidence that no jury ever weighed, because there was never a trial, and, as we will see, barely even an investigation. There is a competing theory, and honesty requires that it be named, and named just as carefully. In this version, it was Ned who shot Plunkett, not the other way around, and the murder-suicide was arranged afterward to protect the family's name. The details offered in support of this theory, the position of the powder burns, the state of the weapon, the delay in calling the police, the movements of the people in the house that night, are genuinely striking. But they come, almost in their entirety, from a single source. A man named Leslie White, an investigator for the district attorney's office who was at the scene, published a memoir 7 years later, in 1936, in which he described details that did not match the official story, and that suggested to him it had not happened the way the record said. In his account, the bodies had been moved before the scene was properly examined. and the pistol that had killed both men carried no fingerprints at all, as though it had been wiped clean. These are striking claims. They are also his claims and no one else's, set down years afterward and never tested. That memoir is the origin of nearly everything the world thinks it knows about a Doheny cover-up. And it is essential to say clearly what that memoir is and what it cannot be. It is one man's recollection, published years after the fact, never tested under oath, never subjected to cross-examination, never weighed by a jury. It may be entirely true. It may be the honest memory of the one man willing to say what he saw, the single official at the scene whose conscience would not let the tidy version stand. Investigators of real integrity have believed him, but belief is not proof, and a memoir is not a verdict, but it is a single, uncorroborated account. And to treat it as proven fact is to do the exact thing this whole story warns against, which is to let a satisfying version stand in for a proven one. Ned Doheny may have been murdered by his friend. Ned Doheny may have died some other way entirely. What can be said for certain is that we do not know, and that the reason we do not know is the subject of the next chapter. Chapter 8. 36 Hours. The most remarkable thing about the deaths at Greystone is not how they happened, it is how quickly the question of how they happened was closed. Within roughly 36 hours of the two men being found, the district attorney of Los Angeles County, a man named Buren Fitz, had ruled the case a murder-suicide and effectively ended the matter. There would be no prolonged investigation. There would be no charges, because the only possible defendant was dead, and, most tellingly of all, there would be no inquest. That last point deserves to be stated plainly, because it is the closest thing this story has to hard evidence of anything unusual. When two prominent men die violently in a mansion in the space of a single night, the ordinary machinery of the law grinds into motion. There is a coroner's inquest, a public proceeding where witnesses testify and evidence is laid out, and a jury of citizens hears the facts and renders a verdict. It is the mechanism by which a suspicious death becomes a public, examined thing. In this case, there was none. The Los Angeles Times reported it flatly a few days later. No inquest on Doheny. The county coroner, a man named Frank Nance, did not convene one. By some accounts, no full autopsy was even performed on Ned Doheny's body before it was released to the family. I want to separate two things that are easy to blur together because the difference is the whole argument. One claim is that Ned Doheny was murdered and the crime was covered up. That claim, as we have seen, rests almost entirely on a single memoir, and it cannot be called proven. But there is a second, smaller, far better documented claim, and it is the one that actually matters. It is simply this. The deaths of Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett were never properly investigated. There was no inquest. There was reportedly no autopsy. The case was closed in a day and a half. And that much is not theory. That much is in the record. Or rather, it is the shape of the hole in the record. An inquest is not a favor the law does for the dead. It is the ordinary expected procedure, the default setting for exactly this kind of death. Its absence here is not the presence of nothing. It is the presence of a decision made by someone that this particular pair of violent deaths would not be examined in public the way almost every other one was. Ask what it would take in 1929 to make a violent double death in a mansion simply close, quietly, in 36 hours with no public proceeding. Ask who would have to make a call, and who would have to receive it, and how much weight a name would have to carry for the ordinary machinery of a coroner's office to decide, in this one instance, not to turn. The district attorney, Buren Fitz, was himself a controversial figure who would later face his own troubles with the law. The Doheny family was among the most powerful in the state, with the money to command the best of everything, including, it is fair to wonder, the cooperation of a county office. None of that is proof of a conspiracy. All of it is the context in which a violent double death went unexamined. A poorer family, in a smaller house, would have had the full weight of the coroner's office come down on them. The bodies would have been opened. Witnesses would have been sworn. The public would have watched. What the Doheny name appears to have bought, in those 36 hours, was exemption from the ordinary scrutiny that violent death brings. And that exemption is worth more than any lease. That is the real question at the center of Greystone, not whether Plunkett shot Ned or Ned shot Plunkett. That question may be genuinely unanswerable. The answerable question is why nobody with the power to find out ever seriously tried. There is one more detail, and it proves nothing, but it stays with you. Ned Doheny was given a great Catholic funeral at the church his own family had built, and then he was buried at Forest Lawn in Glendale, beneath an opulent memorial on the hill. Hugh Plunkett was buried at Forest Lawn as well, down the slope, about 100 feet away. The servant who was said to have murdered the son, and the son himself, laid in the ground within sight of each other. The two men who had carried the satchel to Washington together lie together still. It may mean nothing. It is only geography. But it sits there, a small, silent thing that the official story does not quite account for. If you have made it this deep into the story, these are the ones I make for you. Subscribe and I will keep making them. Chapter 9. The Cleanest Money. While the family buried its son, the courts finally arrived at the question they had been circling for years. What should happen to the two men at the center of Teapot Dome? And the answer they gave is one of the strangest things in the history of American justice, because they gave two opposite answers to what was, in essence, one question. In October of 1929, 8 months after the deaths at Greystone, Albert Fall went on trial in Washington for accepting a bribe. The bribe in question was the $100,000 that Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett had carried to his hotel room in the satchel. The jury found him guilty. He was fined $100,000, the exact sum he had taken, and sentenced to a year in prison. In 1931, he entered the New Mexico State Penitentiary, a broken and ailing man, and became the first person ever to have served in the Cabinet of the United States and then walk into a federal prison for a crime committed in that office. He served most of a year and came out with his health and his fortune gone. He was old, ill, and disgraced, the highest-ranking casualty of the whole affair, a man who had once been talked of as a possible president and who ended as inmate number 6,991 in a New Mexico prison. Then, a few months after Fall was convicted of taking the money, Edward Doheny went on trial for giving it. Same money, same satchel, same hotel room. The charge was bribing Albert Fall, the mirror image of the crime Fall had just been convicted of. And in March of 1930, a jury acquitted Edward Doheny completely. Sit with the shape of that. The law had now declared, formally, through two juries, that the $100,000 in that bag was a bribe when it landed in Albert Fall's hands and was not a bribe when it left Edward Doheny's. It was a crime to receive it and no crime to give it. The same money, passing between the same two men in the same transaction, was simultaneously the thing that sent one man to prison and the thing the other man was found innocent of. It is very difficult to construct a coherent theory of justice in which both of those verdicts are correct, and yet both of them stand in the record to this day, side by side, a conviction and an acquittal for the two ends of a single handshake. If you want to understand, in one image, what a great fortune could purchase in the America of that era, that an ordinary person could not, it is this: not innocence, something better than innocence. The same facts read in your favor. How it happened is not really a mystery. Doheny could afford the finest defense in the country, and he bought it. His lead lawyer, a Washington attorney named Frank Hogan, was among the most celebrated trial lawyers of the age, reportedly paid something close to $1 million for the defense, and he gave a performance for the ages. He wrapped the aging, weeping oil man in the language of friendship and charity and patriotism, and by some accounts compared the prosecution of his client to the crucifixion itself. Fall, meanwhile, ill and nearly bankrupt, could mount nothing like the same defense. His own attorney had earlier called the $100,000 the cleanest money that ever passed from one man to another. The line was meant to defend both men at once, giver and receiver, since it was the same money. The jury that heard Fall's case did not agree. The jury that heard Doheny's did. The cleanest money and the dirtiest money were the identical bills in the identical bag. And then comes the detail that turns the whole thing from merely unjust to something closer to cruel. After all of it, after the trials and the verdicts, Edward Doheny's oil company held the note that Fall had signed for the $100,000, the very note that was supposed to prove it was an innocent loan between friends. And the company called that note in. When Fall could not pay, the Doheny interests foreclosed on his ranch in New Mexico. The Three Rivers spread that the money had helped him save. The loan that a jury had accepted as proof of Doheny's innocence became the instrument that took the last of Albert Fall's world away from him. The man who gave the bribe kept his freedom and his fortune, and then took the bribe takers home as well. There is a version of Albert Fall that deserves no sympathy, a cabinet officer who sold a public trust for cash and bonds and got exactly what such a man should expect. But there is no version of the story in which the arithmetic of the two verdicts makes sense. The receiver of a bribe went to prison. The payer of the same bribe went home. And the payer, having been found innocent of the transaction, then enforced the very document that transaction had produced and took the ranch. Whatever that is, it does not describe a system in which the same act means the same thing, regardless of who commits it. Chapter 10. The Silence. Edward Doheny did not enjoy his victory for long, and by every account, he did not enjoy it at all. The son he had built the palace for was dead. The friend from the mining camps was in prison, ruined partly by Doheny's own hand. The old man withdrew from public life into the mansion at Chester Place, increasingly frail, and he died there on the 8th of September, 1935, at the age of 79, never having been convicted of anything. Whatever the courts had decided, he had outlived the scandal, and he died a free and enormously wealthy man. His widow, Carrie Estelle Doheny, lived on for more than 20 years, and she spent a great deal of the fortune giving it away. She built libraries and funded churches and a seminary and an eye hospital. She assembled one of the great rare book collections in America, including a Gutenberg Bible. She was made a papal countess by the Catholic Church. When she went blind late in life, she founded the institute that still bears the family name and still treats diseases of the eye. She died in 1958, and by then the Doheny name in Los Angeles had come to mean, for a later generation, not a scandal at all, but a library at the university, a drive through the hills, a beach, a foundation, a long list of good works carved into stone. The bribe and the bodies had faded. The philanthropy remained. That, too, is a thing a large enough fortune can arrange, given time. Greystone outlived them all. Lucy Doheny stayed in the house for years after her husband's death, and eventually remarried and moved on. The family sold the estate in the 1950s. The land around it became one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Los Angeles. The mansion itself was nearly torn down until the city of Beverly Hills bought it in 1965 for something in the region of $1.33 million and turned it into a public park. Today, you can walk the grounds where Ned Doheny lived for 4 months and died. The house has become one of the most filmed locations in America. Camera crews shoot scenes of wealth and menace in the very rooms where 2 men died in the dark. One of the most acclaimed films of this century, a story of an oilman loosely inspired by Doheny himself, used the house. Most of the people who watch those films have no idea that the setting is real, or what happened in it, or that the family whose fortune built it carried its money to Washington in a bag. Let me step back from all of it now because the chronology is finished, and the chronology was never quite the point. It would be easy to tell this as a simple story of a rich man who got away with it. The bribe, the dead son, the ruined friend, the acquittal, the fortune passed down and laundered into libraries and place names until the stain was gone. It would be easy, and it would not be wrong exactly, but it would miss the strangest and truest thing about the Doheny story, which is how little was ever actually settled. What strikes me, after going back through all of it, is that almost nothing in this story was ever proven, and that the not proving was the whole achievement. A bribe that convicted the man who took it and acquitted the man who gave it is not a resolved crime. It is a contradiction the law simply declined to resolve. A death that closed in 36 hours with no inquest did not answer the question of how 2 men died. It only sealed it before anyone with the power to ask was allowed to. Even the great theory of murder and cover-up rests, in the end, on one man's memoir. Everywhere you press on this story expecting to find a solid finding, your hand goes through into empty air. What survived was everything you can see. The libraries survived, the Eye Institute survived, the Great Gray House survived, and the beach, and the drive, and the family names spelled out in bronze all over Southern California. What did not survive was any clear account of what actually happened. Ned did not survive his own house. Hugh Plunkett did not survive that night. Albert Fall did not survive with his freedom or his ranch. And the truth of any of it, the real sequence of the money and the deaths, did not survive at all, because no proceeding was ever allowed to fix it in place. I keep coming back to that hotel corridor late in November of 1921, and the 2 young men walking down it with the satchel. Ned Doheny and Hugh Plunkett, the son and the friend, carrying $100,000 in cash to a cabinet secretary's door, and the note the secretary signed and handed back. It is where everything started, and it is the one moment in the whole story that is perfectly clear. 2 men, a bag of money, a signed note. Everything after it dissolves into contradiction and silence. But the corridor is solid. The satchel is solid. The note is solid. And that note, the receipt for a loan that one jury called a bribe and another did not, is very nearly the only thing in the entire story that anyone ever actually proved. The bribe, the killing, the cover-up, all of it comes down to a single piece of paper, signed for money in a bag, carried by 2 young men who would both be dead within 8 years. The fortune bought oil and marble and libraries and the finest defense in the land. It bought verdicts, and it bought the absence of a verdict, whichever the moment required. What it bought last and kept longest was the silence. This is the kind of story this channel exists for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.